Good morning, everyone. So at a time when the pace of technological change is accelerating and geopolitical tensions are intensifying, the question is, how do we harness innovation so it serves not just commercial interests and scientific inquiry, but also national defense? And here with me to share his wisdom is Mac Thornberry. He is, as mentioned, a member of the SCSP Board of Advisors, also was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, where he led efforts to modernize the U.S. military and to try and prod it to embrace innovation. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you have said in the past that innovation is critical for national security. You've also said it needs to happen fast. So in your view, what is the greatest obstacle to its adoption?
It's not the technology. It is the people, processes, the self-interest, the organization that prevents us from moving faster. I have every confidence that the smart people in the Austin area and in Silicon Valley and in Boston and other tech hubs around the country can develop the technology that we need to defend the country. What I have more doubts about is whether our bureaucracies, our organizations, and I'll include Congress, it's not just over at the Pentagon, whether they can move at the speed of relevance. And if there's one characteristic I would say that is crucial now, we're seeing it in Ukraine, we saw it in the Middle East, it's speed. And it's not our best characteristic.
So that was a long list of obstacles. Let's break it down and deal with them one at a time. The acquisition system clearly is a problem, correct?
It is, no question. And we made some, when you mentioned when I was chairman, this was the focus of my main initiative is to try to, and we did some things that were good. Senator McCain was chairman on the Senate side and he had the same goal. We did some stuff that was good, but not nearly enough. You see some things going on in Congress that give me hope. You've got things coming out of the Pentagon that give me hope. So we're doing better, but the key question is, are we doing better fast enough? It gets back to speed.
And the answer is no.
Yeah, and the answer is no, yeah.
So is the acquisition process, in addition to being slow, too fragmented when it comes to innovation? A little bit here, a little bit there, but no really cohesive
it's interesting.
effort.
If you think about Golden Dome, for example, you're taking a bunch of different technologies in different services, and you've got to make them all work together, and you've got to do it at the speed of a missile that's maybe a bunch of missiles that are coming at us. You got to figure out what it is, you got to do something about it. So I think the biggest challenge, just to take that one example General Gutlein has, is making all these things work together. So yes, it is fragmented in acquisition, but it's also fragmented in the operation and making sure that all of these things are compatible and can function together. And that's true across the board. I just think Golden Dome, it's a key issue that we're gonna have to deal with.
This doesn't strike me as a big light bulb revelation.
It's not, but it's hard because if you're in acquisition, if you're a program manager, your pride is in that program and you want to safeguard it. There's human nature involved in protecting your rice bowl. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you have a bunch of people protecting the thing that they're working on, and see some downsides to collaborating with other people, it makes it harder. And so you've got to break through those natural tendencies of not only humans, but organizations of humans.
So how do you do it? I mean, does it require fundamental culture change?
It does, and I believe that it's got to start at the very top when it comes to the Pentagon. Only the secretary and the deputy secretary have the authority and the control of the money to break through these stovepipes that we're talking about. But Congress can put a lot of roadblocks in the system. And so, for example, Congress really wants to be protective of taxpayer dollars. for good reason. They don't want to see them misused, but they put so many strings on the dollars that it's hard to keep up with the change in technology. So more flexibility of funding would be crucial, I would say, to improving our speed.
Congress also wants to protect jobs within their districts, because jobs means votes. And many members of Congress have legacy contractors who are operating on their turf. So is Congress a big part of the problem?
Congress is a significant part of the problem. And you're right. When I represented a district in Texas, I knew that I was the only one who would speak up for my constituents. And so I had a job to do that. But also, if I counted on my colleagues to look at the national interests, and if I was wrong about what's best for the country, then they needed to make sure the national interest was protected, even if I was speaking up for my local interest. And that's the way it needs to work. We need to have that sort of overall leadership of what the country needs to do. And that's especially true as we're looking at the threats that we face with adversaries collaborating with each other, making it all much more dangerous.
So you mentioned John McCain. He was a champion of this. You were a champion of this. Who do you see in Congress now who's really championing change?
Well, I mentioned there's both Chairman Mike Rogers and Adam Smith, who are chairman and ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, and Senator Wicker and Senator Reid on the Senate Armed Services Committee have some really cool stuff in the bills that are moving now. Now, you know, they've got to overcome dysfunction in Congress to get anything done.
Yep.
But they have some really helpful things to help us move faster on the acquisition side this year. And I hope they can get it across the finish line.
In your opinion, at this point in time, is there still too much time, too much money, too much emphasis on the big legacy systems as opposed to the new innovative systems?
There is. But the one thing I try to remind people, it's not like you can stop the world and say, okay, we're going to get rid of all this stuff and we're going to move over to here, because the world keeps moving. So we get rid of a bunch of things. There's still dangers that we require on those older things to help us deal with. So we have to make this transition, absolutely. But it's got to be in a way that is thoughtful, because our adversaries will take advantage of any gap in our capability and drive a truck through it. So we've got to move, and we've got to buy more. That's the reason that people who say, okay, we can save a bunch of money by getting rid of aircraft carriers and just go to a bunch of autonomous naval systems. Well, again, the world's not going to stop. The adversaries are not going to let us get away with that. We've got to do both. We've got to keep the aircraft carriers going because they play a role now, but we've got to buy a bunch of autonomous naval systems because that is clearly the future. We've got to do both.
I read a suggestion somewhere that we should have a dual track budgeting system so that there's a certain amount of money that is put towards those legacy systems, but another big chunk of money put towards innovation and the new systems coming online. Does that strike you as a viable proposal?
I think something along that line makes sense. And I'll, again, to give Congress some credit, Congressman Ken Calvert from California put $1 billion into DIU last year to help it transition programs that it identified and get them over the valley of death that everybody talks about. So a chunk of money that could be used flexibly to produce new systems, I think, is part of the answer. And it needs to be obviously more than that, but that's part of what we've got to do.
And more money overall, would you say, for acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, it's going up, and it needs to go up. If you look at the charts of how much we spend as a percentage of the federal budget, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, we are just going down, down, down. It reached a height in 1985 during the Reagan years, and it's been going, a little blip during the War on Terror, but we don't spend anything like is appropriate for the threats that we face in this time, at least in my view.
When it comes to the money, do we have to be more flexible too? Does the Pentagon need to be more nimble so it can move funding as it sees necessary?
Absolutely. And if you ask me the one thing we could do that would make the most difference in the short term, that would be it. And the flexibility has got to come, a lot of it from Congress. And it's understandable. You know, there'll be a program and somebody will have done something wrong or misused money or something. And so Congress will put a new restriction. Okay, you've got to do it this way, or you've got to report to us every, so often. All these restrictions, but you add those up over the years, and it really constrains the ability to do things, especially at a time when technology is moving so quickly. One of the fundamental recommendations of the National Security Commission on AI, which Eric chaired, was a pot of money for AI applications. And of course that makes sense. All of us can see how fast that's moving. It hadn't happened, but that's an example of how flexibility, both from the congressional side and the Pentagon side, is essential when technology is moving so quickly.
Has that sometimes harsh oversight from Congress, harsh reaction to failures, created a real aversion to risk when embracing risk is so important to embracing new technology?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I kept threatening when I was chairman to have a hearing of program managers whose programs had not worked out, that had failed, and patting them on the back, saying, okay, you learned what didn't work. And I never got my staff to get it set up. But we are too risk adverse. And there's always some yahoo in Congress who wants to go out with a press release saying, oh, the Pentagon is wasting this much money. And it does happen sometimes, and it ought to be fixed. But if you look at the broader enterprise, we are so worried about those headlines, about the Inspector General reports, about all the things that can come, we are risk adverse, and that puts us at a disadvantage when we think about a China scenario or others.
Is there a better way to connect the research and development that's happening in academia, in industry, in startups with the Pentagon? Is there a model that works, or do we still have to create one?
I think we're still working on it. The video at the beginning talked about the organizations that Ash Carter set up, like DIU and so forth. I think those have been very helpful. They've also are still relatively small. And so I don't know that you could make the whole Pentagon work like DIU does, but there's some models that maybe we could learn lessons from. And you're absolutely right. Part of it is the relationship between government and industry, and part of it is the relationship with academia that also has a huge role in this. Over the years, just like congressional restrictions have made it hard to move fast, over the years, I will, as a recovering lawyer myself, I'll say lawyers at the Pentagon have made it really hard to collaborate for government and industry, and even government and academia. And obviously we don't want self-dealing, and there needs to be some rules about that, but I think we've gone too far in putting everybody in their corners. The only way to deal with the challenges by a China that is a unified industry government approach, the only way for us to do it is to collaborate better.
You mentioned DIU. That's one entity. We also have In-Q-Tel. We have various services, have various innovation components. Is it just too fragmented? Is it too all over the map? Or is that a good approach because different segments of the national security community have different needs?
Yeah, I've struggled with this question. It was a necessary approach because you weren't going to fix the whole system in one swoop. So you needed to create organizations like In-Q-Tel and DIU and AFWorks and all of these things. But then the question is, as they go on for a while and they do some good, what happens to the part over here that's not changed? Now you hope that they learn the lessons from these new innovative organizations and incorporate them, and to some extent that's happening, but it's clearly not happening at the speed that needs to be. So we're still grappling with this question of how we can change the whole enterprise at a speed that is relevant to the change in technology and to the change in the threats that we face.
Do you think the Department of War is doing enough to capitalize on innovation that's happening in other countries? Are we looking at what our allies are doing? Are we leveraging what they're doing? Are we collaborating and cooperating in a way that would move us all further?
We're not doing enough, clearly. And I think the premise of your point is exactly right. We can't, as good as we are, we can't do it all by ourselves. And there are allies and partners that have special capabilities that we could benefit from. And besides, we all benefit from being on the same page with each other. And so I am concerned about where we are now. We need to do better with allies and partners. Even though sometimes they're going to slow us down. They're not keeping up in certain areas, but we, as a whole, we will benefit, and our deterrence interests will benefit the more we can work together on
And
these
it makes
things.
it more likely we'll have interoperability should in fact something happen.
Absolutely, which is no small thing.
Not at all. So how would you say that this issue of AI and autonomy is transforming the geopolitical landscape?
Well, I think all of us just watch the news and see what's happening with in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and we see the way that warfare is changing at an incredible pace. But I would also say what we don't see as much is also a significant change, and that is through cyber and social media, the information domain. In other words, we're all familiar with drones. We have the naval, we have the ground domain. There's also the space domain and the information domain. And there have been some stories recently about how AI and autonomy, when it comes to cyber threats combined, are making the disinformation or information campaigns of adversaries much more effective, much more targeted. And it's something that really concerns me. You know, it goes back to basic Sun Tzu. The epitome of strategy is to win without firing a shot. We give adversaries on our own a lot of fodder to work with, but if they can use social media, if they can use targeted cyber campaigns, not just to plant bugs in our infrastructure, water and electricity and so forth, but to fuel internal dissent in the United States, man, that is certainly in their interests.
Is the U.S. doing enough to counter that?
No, absolutely not. We don't even, and it's hard for us because of the First Amendment and so forth, but we've had a lot of turmoil here recently in the organizations in Homeland Security, in the Cyber Command, that were set up to help defend our country against such attacks. And so, you know, there's lots of things to worry about. I mentioned the adversaries collaborating together and adapting together, but the information domain, especially as it affects our internal ability to do what we need to do, is probably the thing that worries me the most.
I did a panel with law enforcement representatives from the Five Eyes, and we discussed fentanyl, we discussed organized crime, we discussed arms trading, and at the conclusion I said to them, what is your biggest fear? What's the thing that worries you the most? And they said, social cohesion, pointing exactly to what you're talking about. Would you agree with their conclusion?
Yeah, no, I think it's true. Let me, if I can, tell you a brief story. Back about well, this was right about 10 years ago, because the Houston Chronicle just wrote a story about this recently. I started getting people coming into my town hall meetings just distraught because they were getting emails that a regular exercise the Special Operations Command normally does was really going to be a subterfuge, and President Obama was going to use the military to go door to door and confiscate people's guns in Texas. It was called Jade Helm. And I would try to talk to people about that. If they were, the military's not going to do that. If they were going to do it, do you think they'd start in Texas, where everybody has a gun? And then part of this rumor was they were going to put people in the basement of abandoned Walmart stores. And I'd try to tell them Walmart stores don't have basements. But it didn't matter. And then it turns out, a few years later, the New York Times ran a story where Russian bot farms were pushing, they may not have originated this story, but they were pushing this story out just by the zillions. And it really played a role in Central Texas, but in the Panhandle, my constituents were upset about it. And it was really the first time my eyes got opened that, okay, a rumor gets started, adversaries see it, they fan the flames, and it can have real consequences for our society. And I think it's just gotten much, much worse since in the last 10 years.
Because of AI and autonomy.
Yeah, any tool can be used for good or for ill. And this is one of the ill effects from AI and autonomy. Now, at the same time, it takes AI and autonomy working together to block that stuff or to deal with it. And that goes back to the organizations that you mentioned, CISA, Cyber Command, others that we count on at the federal level to help protect our society from these information campaigns.
Speaking of our adversaries, what do you think are the big lessons about AI and autonomy we should be taking from them?
Well, I think I don't want to jump the gun. And the next on the stage is General McRyan, and he wrote a paper for SCSP that talked about how they have learned to learn better and adapt. And you see this really not with the Russians and also the Ukrainians. It's nearly hour by hour how they can use these drones and see something, they can adjust, they can try this, and it's a back and forth game. Again, I want to come back to the speed at which that is happening. It's hard to imagine that we could adjust as quickly as both the Russians and the Ukrainians are when it comes to that sort of warfare. But that's a glimpse of not only what is now, but the direction things are headed. And that's where, like Army Futures Command and others have to help us prepare.
Do you believe that there is a need for an international regime of rules, guardrails governing AI and autonomy?
I think we really need to have the conversation, and General Rainey mentioned this in his remarks. Just say, if we are in a war with China, as an example, they will not have the same constraints on the use of AI and autonomy that we might, and we could lose. And so we need to have a conversation. We don't want to become like them, but we need to have a conversation about what we are comfortable with. If there's back to Golden Dome, if there's a barrage of missiles coming at us, we don't have time for an individual to be in the loop saying, okay, we're going to use this to get that missile, this to get that missile. It has to be automated to some extent. And so having the conversation about to what extent we are comfortable with automation, with machines making their own decision about when, how, which, to counter some threat is important, because once they start coming our way, it's too late to have that conversation.
So are you talking about having an internal conversation in the U.S. or an international
It needs to be
conversation?
both. It's got to be both. We need to have serious conversations about AI and autonomy and our ethical principles and what we're comfortable with. And we need to also have that conversation with key allies and partners who are facing much the same challenges that we face.
Better do it quickly, given the pace of development.
Absolutely. And I don't mean to suggest those are easy calls to make. And they will change as the technology evolves. The one suggestion I would have, though, is I think we need to talk more openly with the American people about what our adversaries are doing, because we can have a better, richer, more helpful conversation the more information we have. And we tend to restrict this information, I think, too much. We don't want to give away the store, of course. But if we're going to have an honest conversation about where this is headed and the kinds of decisions that our military leaders are going to have to make, we need to have a clear understanding of where the adversaries are and where they're headed.
So I'm going to give you a chance to lecture your former colleagues. If you could give one piece of advice to current members of Congress about what they could do, should do, to spur innovation in the interest of national defense, what would it be?
Well, the obvious one is do your job. I know, I've been there during shutdowns.
That shouldn't be a tall order,
but it is, for any company thinking about doing business with the Department of Defense, having a shutdown is got to cause you to think, do I really want to mess with those people, or do I just want to focus on the commercial side? And so regular, predictable funding is absolutely crucial, especially if you're trying to attract commercial companies that have a choice on whether they do business with DoD or not. If I could say 1A is more flexibility in the funding you provide. For the reasons we talked about. Everything is moving so quickly. All the strings and stuff that may have made sense at one time do not make sense now. So get them the money, give them more flexibility, expecting transparency and accountability for how the money's used. Make them report back to it, but they've got to have more flexibility.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Mac Thornberry.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.